tonight's extravaganza, which it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Ali Erginsoy. Now, Ali used to be a BBC journalist, so we could expect some kind of whiz-bang technical effects, I'm sure. We could, and he's also a graduate of the Open University's Masters program, shortly to be starting a PhD. And the subject that he's going to talk on tonight is about the Sephardim in the East End of Georgian London. This is a kind of unique piece of research that Ali undertook for his master's dissertation, has worked it up, has developed it further since then, and it's going to be published, cross fingers, very soon, we hope, in the Journal of Jewish Historical Studies. So this is going to be a rare treat, I hope, as Ali reveals this hitherto unseen piece of research.
Hopefully you're seeing something that says an autonomous community in Georgian London, the Sephardim and their welfare. So I'll start. So the drawing you see here is by Thomas Rowlandson from around 1800 of the Rag Fair on Rosemary Lane in the East End of London. And this was an old clothes market which was dominated by Jews, both Ashkenazi and Sephardim. But they're depicted in this drawing in a very stereotypical and sometimes derogatory way, which was common in that period. So we see allusions to the fencing of stolen goods, coining, some of the sellers wearing hats piled on top of each other, and so forth. But our story starts a little further east along in the East End, along the Mile End Road, and you see here that tucked behind the 1970s blocks of Queen Mary University on the Mile End Road in East London is this historical curiosity, what remains of the Novo or New Cemetery of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London. Actually, it's not so new. The Novo was consecrated in 1733 to replace the Velho, these are Portuguese words, or Old Cemetery just down the road, which had reached capacity. And here's the Old Cemetery in green on the bottom left, and the Novo just up the road in pink. The Novo once occupied a site that was perhaps 5 times the size of what's left, but in 1974, the synagogue sold most of the grounds to Queen Mary University, which was looking to expand. And unfortunately, most of the stones were smashed and the remains of around 7,000 deceased dug up and reburied in a mass grave in West London. And this is a decision that still rankles in the community today. The small number of gravestones that remain behind Queen Mary date from after the mid-19th century, so the early ones have been destroyed. But you can see that unlike their counterparts in Ashkenazic cemeteries, the stones of Sephardic Jews lie flat on the ground, and that means, you know, all are equal under heaven. But in life, of course, some were more equal than others. So this talk is going to be about these two groups, the 40% or so of Sephardic Jews whose synagogal taxes and donations funded the 60% who were in receipt of some form of poor relief. And also how, despite this totally voluntary arrangement, by which I mean lacking any powers of government, the congregation managed to maintain its cohesion, its internal unity. The quantitative analysis and data for the research that I did for my dissertation that underlines this talk span a 35-year period from 1767 to 1802. And the reason for that is 1767 is when the congregation started registering both male and female births. It only registered male circumcisions before that. And 1802 is both a convenient and a significant date itself, which I'll come to. But although those are the sort of quantitative parameters, I'll also be erecting some scaffolding, starting in the 1740s and maybe even earlier through to the early part of the 19th century. First, some background, though. So the London Sephardic congregation was founded by a small group of Portuguese merchants, about 40 families in total. And these were descendants of Jews who'd been forcibly converted to Catholicism in Portugal after 1497. They were known as New Christians and also conversos. And they'd been outwardly living as Catholics, but once they were in London, had openly re-embraced their ancestral faith of Judaism after Cromwell readmitted the Jews in 1656. This painting is a modern reimagining of the original house cum synagogue that they first set up on Prechurch Lane in the city of London. The word Sephardic derives from the Hebrew name for Spain, Sepharad, and the London congregation is commonly referred to as belonging to the Western Sephardic diaspora, which took shape in the 17th and 18th centuries and was made up mostly of Portuguese Jews. Their emigration routes can be seen here in the map in the black lines to France, Northern Europe, and further west to the Americas. The earlier Eastern diaspora was formed by Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, so considerably earlier, who made their Peninsula and the Eastern Mediterranean, so the Ottoman Empire. In time, the London congregation came to be known as Bevis Marks after the street on which the community synagogue was inaugurated in 1701. The community grew with the influx of refugees from the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions in the first half of the 18th century. But once this had tailed off, with immigrants from Holland, Italy, and North Africa, who weren't necessarily, some of them were from the Iberian Peninsula originally or descended from people from the Iberian Peninsula, but they are Sephardic rite in the Sephardic manner. And some of them from earlier immigrants to those places. From the mid-17th, population reached a sort of steady level of around 2,000 individuals in an average of about 630 households. Geographically, the community was centered around the so-called Jewish East End. By matching synagogue tax or finta lists to land tax records and wills, I've been able to analyze the residents of the fee-paying members, so the wealthier members, during their search period. And I found that just under 87% lived within a 1-mile radius of Bevis Marks. So primarily in the City of London wards of Aldgate and Portsoken, and in the extramural parish of St. Mary Whitechapel. Now, it is difficult to perform a similar kind of analysis for the poor of the community because records of residence just don't exist. But scholars have identified the eastern fringe of the city, so Houndsditch, Spitalfields, Whitechapel, and Mile End Old Town, all again within 1 to 1.5 miles of Bevis Marks, as areas where poorer Jews, both Sephardim and Ashkenazim, lived. From its inception, the London community operated autonomously. Jewish autonomy is a well-understood concept in the Ottoman Empire, Italy, Germany, and to a more limited extent, Holland. Jewish communities ran their own affairs, empowered by the local authority, both central and municipal, to administer a wide range of functions. The position of Bevis Marks in England was somewhat different. The congregation's lay executive was the Mahamad, which is kind of equivalent to the wardens of a parish church. The Mahamad occasionally sat as a court of arbitration, for example, settling disputes over debt and family fallouts. But this was entirely voluntary. It had no formal jurisdiction, and its decisions were not binding on the parties, who could also turn to the civil courts of the realm. Similarly, the congregation, through the Mahamat, also ran its own welfare system independently of the old poor law. But this too was entirely voluntary. Some of the recipients of relief from the congregation's welfare fund, the Sadaka, could turn to the parish for relief under the old poor law. But as I'll explain later, hardly any did. From the 1720s, the congregation came under immense strain from increased immigration. To start with, these were often penniless refugees from the Inquisition in Portugal, which was still burning so-called Judaizers at the stake, as you can see in these two drawings here. Others who were more fortunate had their assets seized or were exiled to distant towns and cities where they didn't have any means of support. Unsurprisingly, many decided to leave and made their way to centers like Amsterdam and London, where they were welcomed with open arms. But by the mid-1740s, immigration from the Iberian Peninsula had largely died down and was replaced with further waves of less welcome economic migrants from Italy, North Africa, and the Ottoman lands. So to deal with the strain on the congregation's budget, a fundamental change needed to take place in the philosophy that underpinned the system. At the center of the system was the Sadaka Fund, administered by the synagogue's lay leadership, the Mahamat, and the elders, the Velos. Sadaka reflects the way Jews of Iberian origin pronounce the Hebrew word tzedakah, which literally translates as justice or righteousness, but is commonly used to signify simply charity. The operation of the Sadaka during the congregation's first century reflected the rabbinical understanding of charity as righteous behavior for the giver, and of justice and a right due to the recipient. Here it is expressed in a sermon delivered by David Nieto, the Haham, or Sephardic rabbi of Bevis Marks, in 1709, where he declares, "It is natural for the wealthy to give, and it is natural for the poor to receive." This was a conception that would come under increasing strain, as I said, during the second half of the 18th century from immigration, which the congregation's leadership, lacking the powers of either central or local government, couldn't prevent. At the same time, the leadership would have been aware of and influenced by a fairly vigorous debate going on around them in wider English society since at least the 1720s about how to deal with the problem of the poor, in quotation marks. In 1740, the elders voted down a proposal to restrict the tzedakah to a much narrower group, which would have been widows, orphans, and the elderly only. It would appear that the elders balked at such a fundamental reinterpretation of the principles of Jew charity, who was a wealthy financier, philosophe, and writer on economics. And although he was mostly associated with the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, De Pinto also spent time in England, where he had extensive dealings with the British government, funding various war efforts. De Pinto wrote mostly on finance and economics, but he was also the author of a single socio-economic treatise, which he wrote in 1748, while serving as the treasurer of the Amsterdam congregation. The treatise was entitled Reflexões Políticas, Political Reflections, and it analyzed the conditions that had led to increased poverty among Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam and the measures needed to reverse the trend. Challenging the assumption that Jewish paupers were entitled to relief from the Portuguese community as a right, De Pinto lamented, "Why are we obliged to support the weak from all over the world? What would happen if the doors were opened here in Amsterdam to poor Protestants from Europe, Africa, and Asia? Would that act, though apparently a charitable one, not seem ridiculous, ruinous, and even impossible?" Instead, De Pinto proposed a series of radical measures, such as denying payments to new immigrants, barring newly married couples from claiming relief for 3 years, and assisting poor Sephardic families, De Pinto suggested about a third of the total, to emigrate to the Dutch and British colonies in the Americas, which would both reduce the burden on the community's coffers, theoretically, and give such families a chance to escape poverty. De Pinto's treatise has not received much attention from scholars, and where it has, this has been in the context of the Amsterdam community. Its impact on the London community has been mostly overlooked. Although never a member of Bevis Marx, De Pinto must have been a familiar figure there on his visits, and would have been on intimate terms with its leadership. In their eyes, he was one of us, not a rabbi or a dayan or religious judge, who were ultimately employees of the synagogue, but a wealthy financier who had the ear of princes and kings. To be clear, the congregation's leaders were spurred into reform by the rising burden of supporting the poor, exacerbated by the influx of poor Sephardic immigrants. There is, however, circumstantial but strong evidence, I believe, that Reflexiones Politicas gave the leaders of the London community the philosophical validation to change the way they dealt with the poor. So the first reform announced in London was on 30th of October 1748, not long after the publication of De Pinto's treatise, where the elders resolved, in order to discourage the poor who come from abroad, to restrict tzedakah payments to those who had been resident in this kingdom for 7 years in a row. This was later reduced to 5. The only exception was for direct arrivals from Portugal or Spain, which by this time had become negligible anyway. The new policy coincided with growing fears in the wider society in the country about vagrancy and crime following the demobilization of soldiers and sailors at the end of the Austrian War of Succession in late 1748. The leaders of the Bevis Marx congregation were probably influenced by this climate, or saw it as an opportunity to impose restrictions they'd been unable to impose before. The second major change came 6 months later, in May 1749. The elders ordained that allowances to those already receiving relief would remain unchanged. To do otherwise would be cruel, they suggested, but would be phased out as the recipients died. Regular weekly or monthly payments to new applicants, however, would only be made to the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, children and widows of synagogue officials, and families coming directly from Portugal or Spain for the first 2 years of their residence in London. Everyone else, the able-bodied poor, now known as strugglers, occasionally also stragglers, but strugglers seems to be the more common term, would be entitled to casual payments only, and then only on merit. Around the same time, the congregation set up 2 subscription charities, Bet Holim, which is House of the Sick, in 1748, and in 1749, Mahasim Tobim, which translates as Good Works. And this charity funded pauper apprenticeships and extended microloans to strugglers to buy stock or tools for their trade. Both the subscription charity model and the institutions themselves emulated English equivalents. In short, a paradigm shift had come about from a traditionally Jewish understanding of universal charity to one of targeted philanthropy seeking to address the causes of poverty, with an Anglo-Protestant emphasis on industriousness and morality. A major revision to the constitution, or ascamot as they're known, of the congregation in 1781 would make the link to morality even more explicit. It forbade the elders and the Mahamad from admitting to their tzedakah lists any person or family whatsoever who shall not in regard to their good conduct and their necessities. So the convergence of Jewish charity and Anglo-Protestant philanthropy was complete. I commented earlier that Bevis Marx's welfare system was a voluntary one that didn't enjoy any powers conferred by law. Yet, when an opportunity arose to put the system on a statutory footing, the leaders of the congregation turned it down. That opportunity was the Colquhoun Van Owen scheme. The authors of the scheme were Dr. Joshua van Owen, seen here on the left, who was a surgeon to the poor of the Ashkenazi Great Synagogue, one of the three Ashkenazi synagogues of the more numerous right, and Patrick Colquhoun, at the time a metropolitan magistrate and collaborator of the social reformer Jeremy Bentham. Between 1801 and 1802, Van Owen and Colquhoun devised a scheme to address the perceived high levels of criminality among the Jewish poor in London. The scheme was to be introduced by a parliamentary bill and envisaged the creation of a quasi-governmental body that would take over all matters relating to the Jewish poor in London. It would be administered by representatives of all four synagogues, three Ashkenazi and the one Sephardic, in that proportion. It was to be financed by a centralized fund bringing together all the compulsory synagogal taxes, voluntary contributions, and an appropriation of 1/2 of the poor rates paid by Jews to their parishes of residence. This last source of finance was later dropped from the plan, as Joshua van Owen feared it would stir hostility towards Jews among non-Jewish ratepayers, because they might also have to be reassessed for the parishes to make up the deficit. Bevis Marks opposed the scheme from very early on. On 14th of February 1802, the elders met and rejected the involvement of their synagogue by 26 votes to 1, declaring somewhat haughtily that they did not consider themselves justified at present in any wise altering their own political or economical system, which has for upwards of a century past answered every purpose of its institution. As a result of the opposition of Bevis Marks, Colquhoun and Van Owen reformulated their plan to encompass the Ashkenazi poor only. In the end, a brief petition was submitted to Parliament, but never went further than that. The scheme was effectively stillborn. So why did Bevis Marks object to a scheme that would have put relief of the Jewish poor on a legislative footing? Historian Todd Endelman has noted that the Sephardim were a wealthier body than the Ashkenazim and would consequently be forced to contribute a disproportionate amount of the funds to support the project, especially since the Sephardic poor were such a small percentage of the total Jewish poor. But could the leaders of Bevis Marks in fact have been in denial about the scale and nature of the poverty problem in their own community? The Sephardic poor are defined here as those who are at any point in receipt of some form of relief, whether that was a regular pension or casual handouts. This is how the congregation's leaders defined those in poverty, and how the poor, through petitioning for relief, defined themselves. Obviously, what's captured here is relative poverty, although many will also have been in absolute poverty. Throughout the 18th century, portrayals of Jews generally were stereotypical, epitomized by Moll Hackabout's wealthy and no doubt Sephardic protector in William Hogarth's A Harlot's Prey, in the center of the picture on the right, also by Hogarth, his canvassing for votes. Nothing much lay between these two stereotypes. The dominant image of a Jew was of an itinerant old clothes seller, probably engaged in criminal behavior, although this tended to attach more to Ashkenazic Jews. The Prussian author of a contemporary travelogue remarked of the Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews of London, all the children of Israel who are obliged to quit Holland and Germany take refuge in England, where they live by roguery. If they themselves do not steal, they at least help to conceal and to dispose of the plunder. They are therefore so much hated in England that the honesty of their Portuguese brethren cannot weaken the unfavorable impression which such a band of robbers has occasioned. Even Patrick Colquhoun, the Metropolitan Police Magistrate we met earlier, was not immune from such misconceptions. In his treatise in 1800 on policing in the capital, Colquhoun wrote that the members of the Portuguese synagogue, being mostly wealthy and extremely attentive to their poor, among whom there is said not to be a single beggar, or itinerant. In reality, being far less populous than their Ashkenazi brethren, The Sephardic poor, which did include beggars and vagrants, as well as artisans, apprentices, and shopkeepers, were simply less visible. As this simple pie chart shows, around 40% of households where the head paid the synagogue tax known as finta supported the 60% of households who received some form of relief. As a proxy for the latter category, I've used the number of families that were in receipt of free matzot, or unleavened flatbread during Passover. Let's compare this with the Christian parish poor relieved under the Old Poor Law. The scholars behind the London Lives Project have calculated that between 1762 and 1790, the relatively wealthy city parish of St. Dionis Backchurch paid substantial pensions to just under 80 paupers out of a population of just under 800 people, or around 10%. This compares to an average between 1767 and 1790 of 194 heads of households out of 621 in receipt of a Velhos or Bahamad pension, or 31%. That's over 3 times the figure for St. Dionis Backchurch. Now, you may say that St. Dionis was not representative of the national picture or even of London. The London Lives Project has calculated that in the year ending at Easter 1803, at least 8% of the population of the capital were in receipt of regular or casual relief. This compares to 63% of the London Sephardic community in 1802. For the crisis year of 1796, historian Thomas Sokol used a listing of households in Ardleigh, Essex, to demonstrate that 41% were pauperized, so a very high figure, but this is still only 2/3 as large as the 62% of pauperized households in the Sephardic community in 1796. In conclusion, poverty in the Sephardic community was extensive and endemic throughout the period. The proportion of Sephardim receiving regular or casual relief over the period was of the order of 60%, 6 to 7.5 times as many as the 8 to 10% of parish paupers in comparable categories in the capital. But what about the causes of poverty? Some of the causes of poverty in the community were unique to Jews. For example, they were restricted from joining livery companies and therefore disbarred from retail trade in the intramural parishes of the city. Some Jews kept shop in the city by purporting to be wholesalers or taking advantage of loose enforcements by the city authorities. But far easier for those with the means was to open a shop in an extramural parish like Whitechapel. The larger number of those who did not have the means plied a trade as itinerant hawkers or peddlers wherever they could. Excuse me while I just have a sip of water. The profile of the Sephardic community as an overwhelmingly immigrant one also affected the ability to earn a living in London. In my research, I found that as late as 1793, only 53 of the 401 households, so around 13%, receiving relief were headed by men or women born in London. In other words, 87% were immigrant households, and most of those from non-English speaking lands. It is hard to come by reliable figures for the distribution of occupations in the Sephardic community during the period. However, clues can be found in the Bevis Marks Aliens Register of 1803, which was compiled by the synagogue at the request of the authorities. Out of 141 names, a dozen declared clerical occupations, 18 were tradesmen and artisans, which included categories like butcher, confectioner, jeweler, silversmith, perfumer, tailor, tobacconist, cap maker, garter maker, leather maker, slipper maker, silk thrower, and watch string maker. 3 described themselves as laborers, 8 were merchants, and 16 gave no occupation at all. The other category comprised 2 students, 2 employees of the synagogue, and 1 female servant of one of the employees of the synagogue. The largest category, at nearly 42%, consisted of pensioners. and women described by their marital status, so spinster, widow, and wife of. Another large category was dealers in clothes, slippers, spices, china and glass, hardware, and general goods. These were mostly street sellers, as were peddler and a number of rhubarb vendors. The drawing shows a Jewish rhubarb seller in the city dressed in so-called Turkish garb, slippers, robe, and turban, as that was what was deemed exotic. In fact, these rhubarb sellers were not Turks, but Sephardic Jews from Morocco who'd cornered that particular market. The list encompasses a narrow range of trades and occupations traditionally associated with the Jewish communities of London. Todd Endelman has again argued that for most Jews, it was the unstable character of the trades they followed, where a single stroke of bad luck, like somebody stealing their tray of goods, could decimate savings. That was a crucial element in the transmission of poverty from generation to generation. The lack of training in any specialized calling made it difficult for Jews to obtain the kind of employment that provided a steady income. And this was precisely the point made by one Jacob Abadatar Pimentel, an elder of the congregation, when he wrote in a letter to the elders in December 1794, "With what article can our poor supply you? With cane strings, barley sugar, and sweet cakes. A mechanic is scarcely to be found, and few Jewish servants, but what are of German extraction." I should point out that this picture is not of Mr. Pimentel himself, but an unidentified gentleman by an unknown artist in the collection of the Samuel Johnson Birthplace Museum. But I imagine that this is something like what Mr. Pimentel might have looked like. Endelman has pointed out that two of the most common escape routes from poverty, artisanal training and education, were largely blocked for the Jewish poor. In common with the Gentile poor, most families could not afford more than a few years of education for their children before they had to be put to work, and equally could not meet the expenses of having them apprenticed. To illustrate the challenges of poverty in the Sephardic community, I'm going to use a case study. This is of one Joseph Uzily. For much of his life, Joseph was a struggler, one of the able-bodied poor, who were only eligible for casual relief, and that on merit. Historian Julia Lieberman has traced the first mention of Uzily to 1760, when as a youth of about 14, he appears in the minutes of Mahasim Tobim, or Good Works, one of the congregation's subscription charities, as a pauper apprentice to become a shoemaker. That didn't work out for Joseph, and he appears to have fallen out with his master. From around 1767, Uzily's name begins to appear in the minutes of the Mahamad as a struggler, one of the able-bodied poor. Bevis Marx's annual accounts indicate that Joseph received casual relief as a struggler more or less continuously from 1767 until 1771, when he did something very unusual. On 13th of November 1771, he turned up at a meeting of the Mahamad with his twins, aged 2, in tow, demanding to be put on the permanent Mahamad roll for relief. The minutes record that he was insolente, insolent. When he was refused, Uzily filed a complaint that caused the president of the Mahamad and his deputy to be summoned before the Lord Mayor's court to explain why they had refused him. The synagogue responded by commissioning legal opinions in October 1771 from two of the most eminent jurists of the kingdom. These were John Dunning, who had stepped down as Solicitor General the previous year, and Edward Thurlow, Attorney General since January 1771, and a future Lord Chancellor. The synagogue's brief to the two jurists described Joseph as an idle person capable of earning his living. When they delivered their opinions, Dunning and Thurlow stated that the congregation's system of poor relief, funded by a tax on wealthier members, was entirely voluntary, and that it had no legal obligation to relieve Uzily. Moreover, there was nothing hindering him from applying for relief to his, it has to be said, unnamed parish of settlement, which they stressed did have a legal obligation towards paupers of all faiths. Unsurprisingly, given those opinions by such eminent jurists, the Lord Mayor's Court threw out Joseph's appeal. As is often the way, we never hear Joseph's voice in any of this, only those of the elites who were judging him. His temerity in challenging the Muhammad earned Joseph lasting notoriety in his lifetime and beyond. 100 years later, the traveler and antiquarian historian of Anglo Jewry, James Picciotto, would describe Uzily as an incorrigible vagabond. This was clearly not a first-hand impression, but was it any less biased than the contemporary description of him as an idle person? The records show that by the time of his dispute with Muhammad in 1771, Joseph was married, and he and his wife Esther had a 4-year-old and twins aged 2. Esther was more or less continuously pregnant, giving birth to at least 14 children, only 5 of whom survived past the age of 12, until her own death in September 1782, apparently in childbirth. These were the classic conditions of young family life cycle poverty, where the oldest children are not yet working or old enough to look after the youngest, to allow the wife to work, or where the wife is constantly pregnant or nursing and cannot work. So Joseph Uzily may or may not have been an idle person or even an incorrigible vagabond, but the family were certainly in need. This chart shows that households with children under the age of 5 receiving casual relief represented between 17.4 and 26% of all strugglers, so around roughly a quarter. The year 1795, where the figure was 22%, is interesting, as this was the peak of the subsistence crisis that gripped the whole country. And you would have thought that if the Muhammad had recognized struggler households with small children as a special needs category, especially during a subsistence crisis, the figure at the end of 1795 would have been higher. But this is not particularly surprising, since life cycle poverty was not properly identified as a potential cause of poverty until Seabohm Rowntree did so in 1901. Joseph Uzily's desire to join the Muhammad roll was understandable. The difference between relief levels on the roll and that of the strugglers' roll was substantial, about 7 to 8 times as much, as you can see in this chart. Strugglers are the blue line at the bottom and Muhammad roll pensioners the red line, and the figures on the left are pounds. However, the Muhammad were inflexible in applying the rules. As an able-bodied person, Joseph Uzily was only entitled to casual relief. He'd have to find his own means to eke out an existence. Now, a strand of scholarship on poverty and welfare in the long 18th century has focused on what's called the economy of makeshifts. This refers to the strategies paupers employed to make ends meet, so levering things like kinship and neighborly support, but also more nefarious means like crime, prostitution, and begging. Many of these stratagems can also be seen among the Sephardic poor in London. Some extended families in the community were very large, providing kinship networks or potential support. But Joseph Uzily's wider family was small, consisting of his father, David, his mother Hannah, and a brother, Mordecai. Even though that was the case, there is still evidence of some family solidarity. The records of Mahasim Tobin show that his father, David, put up his own monthly tzedakah allowance as collateral for 3 small loans to Joseph in 1766, 1772, and 1775. The charity provided these interest-free loans to strugglers to help them buy stock or tools for their trade, but paupers could have different ideas. Already in 1767, the treasurer of Mahasim Tobin was complaining that the poor were misusing the loans as a makeshift. Few are the poor who want to work, yet the money we lend them is spent on food instead of being put to use for tools and supplies. The little they must repay us monthly, they take it out of their mouth. Therefore, what we do on their behalf seems of little use to them. Another tool of social control at the disposal of the Muhammad and the economy of makeshifts for paupers was assisted emigration, an allowance known as despacho. would-be emigrants to the American colonies received the equivalent of 3 years' assistance, while despacho for destinations in Europe with Sephardic communities was 1 year's assistance. This was a calculated gamble on behalf of the synagogue authorities that it would be cheaper over the long term to pay paupers to go away than to maintain them in an open-ended arrangement. The minutes of the Mahamad reveal that in April 1772, Joseph received despacho of £2 and 2 shillings to take his family by the road when he's ready to leave to an unnamed European destination, probably Italy. Yet Joseph does not appear to have kept his side of the bargain, pocketing the despacho even though he did not travel. So yet another example of the economy of makeshifts in action. In later years, the Mahamad would penalize such failure to emigrate. The 1781 revision of the Askemat or Constitution of the Congregation dictated that if any person or family receiving despacho did not emigrate, or having emigrated returned, they were barred from relief for 3 to 10 years, depending on the amount of despacho they'd received. Another revision introduced by the rule changes of 1781 explicitly excluded anyone from benefits if they had summoned the Mahamad or the elders before any magistrate or court of justice to complain of failure to answer his petition or grant the charity required, or any other complaint against our government, which is precisely what Joseph had done some years earlier. Yet, the records show that in August 1783, Joseph did just that again. Once again, the Uzily family's history tells a story of life cycle hardship. Joseph's wife Esther had died 11 months earlier in childbirth, leaving him with 3 children, the youngest aged 3 and the oldest 14. His father, whose tzedakah allowance had underwritten loans to Joseph, had also died in 1782. The Mahamad and the Lord Mayor were even less sympathetic than on the previous occasion. Not only was Joseph refused, but in a humiliating performance, he was made to apologize publicly before the entire congregation. Joseph would remarry in 1785 and have 3 more children with his second wife, Rachel, continuing to receive casual relief at least once a year until 1789, and then for 11 more years between 1791 and 1802. Long spells on the struggler's roll were not unusual. I have not tracked Joseph Uzily's life course beyond 1802, but the records indicate that he died in 1810, leaving behind a widow and 3 out of 17 children from 2 marriages who'd survived into adulthood. So why didn't Joseph petition his parish of settlement for relief? It turns out hardly any Sephardic Jews did. Few parish pauper records for areas of London where Sephardim lived alongside the wider population have survived to test the perception that Bevis Marks looked after its own. But fortuitously, one of them has, St. Botolph Aldgate. A review of over 6,300 settlement and bastardy examinations of the parish between 1767 and 1799 have not thrown up any positively identifiable names that match those in the Bevis Marks records. Now, this absence of matches is not definitive proof that no Sephardim accessed parish relief, but it does suggest that if they did, it was very rare. The most obvious incentive for Sephardic paupers to choose old poor law relief over the congregation's own system would have been if relief from the parish exceeded that from the congregation. Now, direct comparisons are difficult to make, but I've calculated the average expenditure on the typical pensioner in the parish of St. Dionis Backchurch and Bevis Marks between 1762 and 1790. For St. Dionis, this came to 2 to 2.5 shillings per week, and for Bevis Marks, 1 shilling and 8 pence. The difference of 4 to 10 pence per week is not insubstantial, but was clearly not enough to tempt the Sephardic poor away, assuming, of course, that the parishes would have them. Parish vestries were just as keen to maintain the status quo as the Mahamad were. Vestries still collected the poor rate from Jewish ratepayers without having to relieve an additional body of Jewish paupers. But even if parish vestries had been keen to take on the Sephardic poor, There were other obstacles in the way of such an option. Only a small minority of the Sephardic poor could prove legal settlement in a parish, and this could only be established through a limited number of conditions: by birth in the parish, serving an apprenticeship in the locality, being hired for a year, holding a local office, or paying local taxes, or by renting or owning local property. Just 10.5% of strugglers in the research period were born in London, while the figure for Mahamad roll pensioners was 4.5%. So even if a Sephardic pauper could prove legal settlement, there was also the deterrent of the workhouse test, introduced by an Act of Parliament in 1723. This gave parishes the option of forcing paupers seeking relief to accept being incarcerated in the workhouse, a pretty grim place, and this was known as so-called indoor relief, as opposed to outdoor relief in the community. By the mid-18th century, most London parishes had invested in accommodation of this type, including parishes with Sephardic populations. The workhouse of St. Mary Whitechapel housed 600 inmates by 1776, and another in Christchurch and Spitalfields up to 300. St. Botolph Aldgate operated another large workhouse housing 300 inmates in 1776 on Gravel Lane off Houndsditch. In 1803, this workhouse housed 45% of the parish's permanently relieved poor, meaning that in theory, there would have been an almost even chance of a Mahamad roll pensioner seeking parish relief going into the workhouse. Yet, the Register of Pauper Admissions for the crisis year 1794, for example, contains no identifiable names of Sephardic Jews. This is unsurprising, as any Sephardim entering the workhouse would have undergone a settlement examination, which, as previously noted, has not produced any matches. But another reason, often given not least by Jeremy Bentham in 1778, which prevented Jews from entering workhouse, was that these institutions could not cater for their dietary requirements and observances on Jewish holidays. This is overstated. There's no evidence that Sephardic Jews in any social strata were particularly scrupulous in their religious adherence during the 18th century. In 1767, the elders themselves decried as a scandal and a disgrace that there were many Jews among us who publicly break the Sabbath, eat unclean food, and do not attend the synagogue even on solemn festivals. A more significant deterrent than the dietary regime to entering the workhouse would surely have been fear that anti-Jewish sentiment in the general population could translate into physical or verbal violence from the other inmates. Then there would have been the disincentive that the workhouse test was actually itself designed to engender, which is incarceration in an institution that only the most desperate would accept. In short, for the minority of Sephardic poor entitled to parish relief, the alternative of outdoor relief by the Mahamad was far more palatable, the disadvantages of the poor law system outweighing the marginal advantage of slightly higher relief levels. In the last 4 decades of the 18th century, the leadership of Marx was remarkably successful on 2 counts: maintaining a voluntary welfare system in the absence of statutory powers, while still keeping the faithful in its orbit. We've seen that the scale of Sephardic poverty was very high, with a much greater proportion, 61% in receipt of relief, than in the contemporary metropolitan parishes, which was around 88 to 10%. Yet despite this unfavorable social composition, the leaders of the congregation were able to keep relief spending under control as well. They did this by gradually restricting the criteria for entitlement to groups they regarded as the most vulnerable: widows, orphans, the aged, and the sick and disabled, at the expense of the able-bodied poor. This required a parallel shift in the philosophical underpinnings of welfare, from a traditional Jewish one of charity as a right to one more in line with the contemporary Anglo-Protestant ethos behind the old poor law, where entitlement was increasingly based on industriousness and morality, But how cost-effective could the policy said to have been if its impact were to drive either poor or wealthier Sephardim away? I've argued that for many of the poor, there was no alternative as they could not establish settlement. Yet even those that were entitled did not apparently seek relief from parish overseers, probably because they were reluctant to submit to the workhouse test widely used in the parishes where they lived. In this talk, I've sought to examine the issue of cohesion, not through the centrifugal forces pushing Sephardim away, but the centripetal forces holding them in: welfare provision, family, and community. Another way of expressing this would be the gravitational pull exerted by the locality, what I've called the gravity of place. This is not as revelatory as it sounds. The very first article of every iteration of the Ascamot after 1664 explicitly prohibited, duly considering how important is our union, setting up another Sephardic congregation in London. This was punishable by instant herem, or excommunication. Historians argue over the motivation behind this prohibition, some attribute it to the desire to control income and welfare spending, others to maintaining social and political control over the community so as not to cause scandal to the natives of the city. But whatever the motivation, the effect of the prohibition was to place Bevis Marks at the center of gravity of Sephardic London in a spatial sense. This detail is from Horwood's map of 1799, showing the position of Bevis Marks Synagogue. And the main effect of the pull of place was undoubtedly on the poor. The revised Ascamot of 1781 dictated that anyone receiving assistance of any kind was obliged to attend synagogue every Sabbath and festival and on other days of the week as much as possible. Failure to do so without a satisfactory excuse would result in sanctioning the loss of whole or part of the assistance for 3 months. While the Mahamad might have seen this harsh sanction as an opportunity to instill greater outward observance among the poor, the effect would have been to circumscribe where the poor could live, because to comply, they would have had to reside within walking distance of Bevis Marks. The poor, and therefore more affordable parts of the East End, were where the poor had been living long since before 1781 anyway, so the effect might better be described as reinforcing existing barriers to spatial mobility. A corollary of this, however, would have been preserving communal identification and access to kinship networks, since everybody was pretty much living in the same place. Higher up the social scale, Sephardic artisans, small traders, and shopkeepers also preferred to stay in the Aldgate Whitechapel area, attracted by the same community and kinship networks, as well as lower rents. The gravitational pull of the locality on the richest segment was much weaker. The well-documented defections and conversions that accelerated towards the mid-19th century began not among the poor and middling sort in the area near Bevis Marks, but among the heirs of the rich that had grown up outside its orbit. The wealthiest Sephardim had carriages and had been taking up residence away from the Aldgate Whitechapel axis since the end of the 17th century. A scattering acquired country homes on the fringes of London, while a larger concentration could be found in Hackney, a rural hamlet 2.5 miles from Bevis Marks. Some wealthy merchants and brokers maintained a city residence above their offices, or in the elegant new houses on Devonshire Square, seen here in the picture, and in Goodman's Fields just to the east. But from 1800, these areas had started to become unfashionable, and affluent Sephardim followed their Christian counterparts to the West End. In 1842, a group of wealthier congregants broke away to set up the reformist West London synagogue together with some similarly wealthy Ashkenazim. Eventually, the Mahamad and elders of Bevis Marks allowed the establishment of the first new Sephardic synagogue in West London on Wigmore Street in 1853. The area around Bevis Marks and worship in the synagogue itself was abandoned to the lower strata of the community, which by then had become thoroughly mixed through marriage with the Ashkenazim. In short, the union of the congregation was broken, the center unable to hold against more powerful social forces like acculturation, assimilation, and secularization. Thank you very much for listening.
No, thank you, Ali. That was absolutely fantastic.